So here, all righty. Okay, make sure this is the right one here. Yep, this is it. Okay. Okay. Well, we've been going over each week the points of how we know Christianity is true. If you've missed some of these clips or other things, I do send them out. So hopefully you're getting them. If you haven't, email me or put your email in the chat room and I will try to get you the other ones you missed. But you can always go to my YouTube channel. Just type in Eric Chabot, Chabot. Most of them are uploaded there. But yeah, we went over, first week we went over truth. We talked about some logic, how we use logic to know things and what truth is. We define truth. Is truth knowable? And then we spent the next 2 weeks after that talking about God's existence. Spent a couple weeks on that. And then we talked about miracles last week. We spent some time on that. And so tonight we are talking about history now. We're going into the actual New Testament documents. So you notice the order of the points are that each thing builds on another. I mean, if someone doesn't believe truth is knowable and God's not knowable, then you're going to have a problem getting down to the rest of the points, right? And if someone doesn't believe God exists, obviously they're not going to be miracles are possible. But as you know, the Bible's filled with miracles. We know that Jesus did miracles, and the miracle of the resurrection's there, the miracle of the virgin birth. So all those things are miracles, and they're not possible. I mean, they're not obviously not on the table if you don't think there's a God, right? So that's why we kind of build up our way into miracles. And then now we're going to point 6 on the New Testament reliability. So that's how each point builds on each other. Now, tonight we're going to talk about how if miracles are possible in actual, which they are, then we should really expect God to show up in history somewhere. If he wants humanity to know what he's like and what his intentions are for humanity, then he's going to have to do something. He's going to have to reveal himself somewhere in the course of human history. And of course, we believe he's done that through the person and work of Jesus, the Messiah. And of course, the events in Jesus's life are all recorded in the New Testament. Of course, there's things in the Old Testament that talk about him coming, but the point is that these things are in the New Testament. So anyway, so that's where we are headed tonight, and we need to talk about those very documents, right? Okay. So what does it what does it mean to say something is historically reliable when we talk about that? Now, we could say it means all these things, really. When you say something's historically reliable, we say that, hey, you know what? When I read the New Testament, I'm assuming the events in there, the people, the geographical locations are based on real factual historical events, right? They really happened. This isn't like reading The Lord of the Rings or Harry Potter. I mean, these are real places, real people, real events. And that's probably part of what we mean when we say historically reliable. Secondly, we could say that we mean the text has been transmitted accurately, meaning that it's been handed down to us, transmitted accurately. And then thirdly, we probably would say that we say something historically reliable, we'd have to say we trust the witnesses, right, who wrote about these events. They're the ones that recorded it. We weren't there. As I've said before, the Bible was wasn't written to us, but written for us. So we weren't there we weren't the original audience. Of course we weren't. I mean, I wasn't there when John wrote John, and I wasn't the audience in Matthew. I wasn't part of the audience in Mark and Luke and Paul's letters. I wasn't in Ephesus. I wasn't in Thessalonica when he wrote those letters. So, but they are written for us as well, even though they weren't written to us. So that's a topic for another time. And then we may say, like number 4, can we trust the events in the New Testament? I mean, these are miraculous events. You're talking about a lot of miracles, talking about Jesus walking on water, nature miracles. I talked about that last week. So some people as I said last week, they write off the New Testament right away because they don't believe their worldview won't allow them to allow miracles into their worldview. They reject the miraculous to begin with. So that's obviously more of a worldview issue, like we talked about last week. Now, of course, Christians will say, in many cases, when you ask someone, why am I a Christian, or how do you know you're a Christian, or how do you know Christianity is true, or why do you follow Jesus? Why are you so committed? A lot of times we'll say that we have the assurance of the work of the Holy Spirit in our lives. We have this subjective kind of supernatural certainty, right? It's so real in our lives, and there's no need to question it because it's so real, which it is. But we need to understand, of course, as I've said before, that other people from other faiths have religious experiences as well. We know that if you've ever been witnessed to by Mormons, we know that sometimes they come along and say, well, if you read the Book of Mormon, the Holy Spirit will confirm for you that the Book of Mormon is true. You'll feel this experience, this what we call like an inward burning in your bosom that is definitely the Holy Spirit bearing witness to you that the Book of Mormon is true. So that creates problems, of course, because it just shows you need, as I've said before, you need more on your tool belt than simply religious experience. Just like you're building a house, you need more than a hammer. You need a screwdriver, you need a tape measure, you need this, you need that. So, religious experience is important, but it can't be the only thing that you rely on, right? So anyways, no doubt Jesus is the most debated person in probably human history. There's been plenty written on him, plenty misunderstandings, and plenty of times people have tried to create him in their own image. They come up with their own image of what he looked like, and they try to fit him into their cultural context and things like that. So anyways, but that's obviously created some challenges. So I've always said that this is one of my favorite books if you want to brush up on your historical reliability of the Gospels, primarily. Well, really the New Testament mostly, but that's a really good book. If you want to read that book, that's one of my favorite books. Also, these are good books. The one on the far right is a great book, The Historical Reliability of the New Testament. I've talked about some of these before. These are all good books. If you want to go deeper on historical Jesus studies, I like history, so as you can see, this is why these are so important to me. Anyways, you get these on the slide set. If I send it out, you can look up these books on Amazon, decide what you want for Christmas, okay? Okay, these are some more current books right here. These are really good books. Okay. So our starting points, and most starting points for what happened there? Sorry. For Jesus is most people assume these New Testament documents are reliable. Oops, sorry to keep going back. It won't stay white for me. And I think we believe historical evidence is there for Jesus, so we trust that. Okay, I'm just going to skip that slide. It's not working. Okay, that's our general starting points back here. I think most people sit in churches, assume the New Testament documents are historically reliable, and that's just the way it is, okay? So no doubt we weren't there. We weren't there to participate in the past. We weren't there to see Jesus. We didn't, we weren't there for the events in the Bible. I think we all know that. Just like a lot of things in history are in the past, a lot of things in science are in the past. We weren't there to observe the beginning of the universe or how life began on Earth. We weren't there to see all the initial conditions, the way they were set up. We weren't there to see how first life got going. There's just so many things in the past we weren't there to observe, so we rely on the data. We look at reports, we look at documents, we look at eyewitnesses, if they wrote about it. We look at archaeology, artifacts, what we call circumstantial data, what has survived, and then we try to come up with the best explanation for what happened. That's what we do in history. And so, like I said, some people may not allow miracles into the picture, meaning that their worldview will not permit miracles because they don't believe God exists. Therefore, they're going to write off most of the Bible, right, as not being true because their worldview is, the Bible has all kinds of miracles, right, as I said, so they're not going to allow it. So we're theists, meaning that our worldview is theism, meaning there is a personal God who intervenes into history, and we believe miracles are possible and actual. So that's what we talked about last week. Now, there's no doubt back in the days of Jesus, you probably know that they didn't have access to, they didn't have any video cameras, their internet, or their phones. They couldn't text or post things on Twitter and Instagram and wherever they want to. These things just didn't exist. So it's unrealistic to try to, ask for that kind of stuff. Like, why didn't they do something more to record about Jesus? Well, they used what they had, and that is a different culture, different time period, of course. So one thing that we don't want to do is demand direct evidence. That means that evidence that we see directly with our eyes. We can't get direct evidence with things in the past because we weren't there to see it. Just like I talked about a couple slides back, and we weren't there to see things in science as well. So that's why science studies the past, studies the present too. History studies the past, studies the present too. But for events in the past, they're gone. And we can't ask for direct evidence. We can ask for circumstantial evidence. That's the way it works in a court of law. When a cold case investigator sees a murder victim, and then they weren't there to see how it happened, and they collect their evidence and they present it in a court of law, right? That's how people are tried, under circumstantial evidence. Most of the time, though, when historians are looking at the New Testament, they're not looking at it necessarily as a holy book. They're just looking at it like as a collection of ancient documents, like other works from antiquity. In the first century, obviously, they didn't have a New Testament. When Jesus is walking around, there's no New Testament. They have all compiled together, and they're just like passing it around. It wasn't put together yet. So they were really reading mostly the Old Testament at that time. And so the New Testament, of course, came together at a later period, which I talked about another clip a long time ago. But the formation of it, the starting points are there, but it didn't all get put together till later. The whole thing got put together. Now, I want to say one thing that we need to think about is that we want to think about when historians look for evidence, or they're looking at documents, they always want the earliest documents, which makes sense. They want the earliest records they can get hold of, because the farther you go an event, like later on, like decades and decades, really, really, really further away. If you take like second century, Jesus was in the first century, right? And then you get into second century, third century documents, you can see generally they've been kind of embellished. They're not like, you could read like the Gospel of Mary that's written in like the second century, but it obviously wasn't written by Mary because Mary was dead by then. So certainly couldn't have been her writing it. And it's got all kinds of embellishments in it. So, they want the earliest documents. The closer to the event, the better, which makes sense. Okay. Because that's the most reliable. The further you get away, more and more further away, decades and decades and decades and decades, generally there's problems. Now I'll talk about this a little more as time goes on. But the earliest records we have for Jesus are Paul. And so Paul has the earliest documents, okay, that says anything about Jesus. It's actually not the Gospels. It's not Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. It's Paul. Okay, and if you date Paul's letters, they're generally dated between 48 and 65 AD, around there. Paul came to faith in Jesus probably between 30 and 40 AD. Jesus was executed about 33 AD. Paul came to faith probably shortly after that, because his writings are dated probably 48 to 65 AD, around there. So in Paul's letters, now remember, Paul's letters are not gospels, they're letters. They're letters written to different cities for different purposes, right? Different things were going on. He had to address doctrinal issues or community issues. But Paul wrote Paul wrote the majority of the New Testament. All these letters are dated fairly early compared to, even anything else. And one thing that Paul, let's go back here one second. Let me go back here. I'm going to skip ahead here. And one thing that Paul does is he talks about historical aspects of Jesus's life. Okay, he's not writing a gospel, but he does seem to be aware of the historical aspects of Jesus' life. He records things that Jesus, like a real person, he ate, he had brothers, he was crucified, he was raised from the dead, he was seen, he was born of a woman, things like that. So Paul seems to be aware of certain aspects of the life of Jesus, okay? Now, one of the earliest records we have for Paul, Paul's writings about Jesus's resurrection, of course, is 1 Corinthians 15. So the actual earliest document we have is not the Gospels. It's Paul's letter in 1 Corinthians 15 that records that saying there that Jesus died for our sins according to the scriptures. He was buried. He was raised on the third day according to the scriptures. So this seems that Paul received this information at an earlier day. It says he received this from somewhere else, okay? And if you go to the map here, he probably received it somewhere between 30 and probably 40 AD, somewhere in there. Now, he wrote 1 Corinthians in 55 AD, but he probably received that message or that teaching somewhere between 30 and 40. He probably got it from Peter in Galatia when he went to visit Peter, because if you read 1 Corinthians 15, if you go back there, he talks about all the appearances of the resurrection. He mentions Cephas there. That's Peter's Aramaic name. So you have to figure he had to know that. How did he get that information about Peter? Probably got it from Peter. So that's probably went to Galatia to visit Peter. He got some of that information. So Paul, no doubt, is the earliest source we have for Jesus. Now, some people may say, well, how can they record the information so accurately? Well, remember, before anything was written, it was passed on orally, because Jesus lived in an oral culture. Jesus taught orally. Of course, everything generally is passed on orally first. That's the way most things are passed on. Then it's written down, generally. But of course, in history in that day, they taught a lot of things orally. So in a Jewish culture, there was a lot of oral tradition going around, or what we call oral memory. So a good definition of oral tradition is that's something that is passed down one generation to another, and then it persists over a number of generations. You could even say that about, like, if someone was a Holocaust survivor way back in the 40s, the 1940s, and they passed on what happened to them, we know that story can be passed on for a number of generations. Like, this is 2023. There's still eyewitnesses alive today, some left, not many, but some. And the point is that these things are passed down one generation to another. Okay, I mean, because it's something that has to be told, and they keep telling it. Now, oral history is related to that. That's what you get when someone asks the eyewitnesses for their recollections. If you're talking to the actual eyewitnesses from the Holocaust, that's where they actually give you an account of what happened. So there's certainly a direct relationship between oral tradition and oral history, as you can see. Now, Jesus is no doubt seen as a rabbi in the Gospels. He is a teacher. Sorry for my numbers being out of order here, but he's not a formal rabbi in the sense that he had the formal academic rabbinical training. Just like today, rabbis have to go and, be formally trained. Jesus, as far as we know, he didn't get any formal training, but we know that he did sit in the synagogue or in the temple growing up a lot. He received some training. We don't know exactly how much, but we know that he is seen as an oral teacher. I mean, he's telling them things that he keeps repeating some of the same things orally, tells them not to forget certain times. He's certainly teaching things orally. Okay. And of course, he's called rabbi many times, which just means teacher, right? We know that Jesus seemed to memorize a lot of the Old Testament because he's quoting from the Old Testament a lot, right? He quotes things from the Torah and other parts of the Old Testament. Okay. So he was definitely an oral teacher of some kind. Now, the only way oral tradition is passed on accurately is you need someone to transmit that accurately. You need like someone in the chain to transmit that accurately. And also you need certain things in place that they can remember and memorize what's being taught. Okay. And so Jesus's teaching, if you look at the way he taught, some of the devices he used, especially a lot of his teaching's poetic, he's using some things there, some teaching devices that allows them to remember things. Yes, they had the Holy Spirit that came later. They recalled it to their mind. I know about that, John 14. But the point is that he did teach in a certain way so things can be remembered. Okay. And of course, Jews were used to memorizing lots of things. They had to memorize a lot of the Old Testament, and they had to seek out a rabbi to teach them. And the rabbi would teach them things, and they would memorize things. And in Jesus's case, no one sought him out. He sought his own disciples out, right? He called them to himself. So the point is that he's using certain devices to help them to remember things as far as his teaching techniques. So remember, as I said, in Jewish education, you could get an education in synagogue, the home, and there were schools at that time. And as I said, they had to recall a lot of information from the Old Testament. They had to memorize a lot of stuff from the Old Testament, far greater than what the Gospels are, okay? So the point is that everything is transmitted orally before it's written down, okay? And so Paul, everything he writes down, he's receiving it orally first before even he writes it down. And everything the gospel authors are writing down, it's already transmitted orally first, so it's way before they even write it down. So the story of Jesus was, everything about him was probably being transmitted very quickly. If you look between like 30 and 40 AD here, probably the earliest information about him, just that he died, rose from the dead, some other things about him, is already being spread orally. It just didn't get written down till after that, later on. Okay. Now, there is a good book out, which I have, that this guy right here, he challenges what we call the traditional dating in the New Testament. He thinks the Gospels are written much earlier than what people think they were. So that's kind of his book he came out with last year to talk about that. You can get that. Anyway, but let's talk a little bit about what kind of the Gospels are. Like, what are we reading when we read the Gospels? You talk about like genre. When you guys study like certain music, some of you like jazz music, some of you like rock music or pop music or classical or gospel music or whatever, worship music. I mean, the point is that we may like different genres, right? Just like certain movie genres we like. And so we need to ask sometimes, like, what is the type of literature we're reading? Well, when we read the book of Revelation, it's apocalyptic literature. When we read the book of Psalms, that's poetry, right? When we read the prophets, that's historical writing. But the Gospels are different. They're talking about biographies. They're a type of biography. Okay, they're not modern biographies, but they're ancient biographies. That doesn't mean they're unreliable, but they're not going to be as precise on certain things as a modern historical biography would be. They're also not as interested in recording every detail of the person's life they're writing about. They're not interested in every single aspect of their life. They only record what they think is really important to know about that person. That's why there's not a lot about Jesus' childhood in the Gospels, because it's not important. Maybe important to us, not important to them. So, as my friend says, when you play cards, you get the deck of cards you get. That's the deck you were dealt. So that's the deck of cards we have, are the Gospels. And so if you don't like them and you want a different card set, you aren't getting a different card set. That's what God gave us. So that's the card set we have. Now, like I said, it's not the goal. The goal is not to recount every detail of the person's life in a kind of an ancient biography. Okay. How someone died is really important. That's really important for an ancient biography. That's why there's a lot of information about Jesus's death, because that's a very important thing in that world. So that's part of what we're reading, or some kind of ancient biography. And so when this guy wrote this book comparing the four Gospels to other kind of biographies, he noticed some similarities between the Gospels and other ancient biographies. They're generally broken down like three main parts about the person: the birth, the public life, and the death of a person, with the bulk of the book being devoted to the subject's public career. And that's kind of what we have with Jesus's life, right? And then also, the Gospels are also a form of testimony. That means that they are unique, because as we probably know, we're trusting the testimony of the gospel authors, trusting their testimony, what they saw, their experience with Jesus. They recorded it. They're eyewitnesses. We're trusting them, okay? And that's fine. We trust. You can't live without trusting testimony of others, right? That's how we know anything, really. Yes, you can test the witnesses if you need to, that's fine, but definitely the Gospels are a type of testimony. Okay, no doubt about it. The Gospels also rooted in the memories of the earliest eyewitnesses. This is their memories, that Jesus's life made an impact on them. Okay, so this is a type of historical writing that certainly has to do with a high impact event that impacted the disciples, and they wrote about it. Now, sometimes people might say, well, just like from a skeptic's perspective, that I can't really trust memory. People forget things. How can you know they're really getting it right? People forget details. Sometimes they exaggerate. Sometimes, their memories go bad. But, honestly, if you study history, maybe your own lives, you'll notice that a high impact event, you can remember it quite accurately many decades later. That's why Holocaust survivors could remember what happened to them several decades later. They could teach on it, write about it. World War II survivors, that was a high impact event. They remember it accurately. They can write about it, talk about it. The death of a loved one. I lost my sister in 1974. I'm 54 now. That was 50 years ago. I was 4 years old. I can remember that day so clearly, what happened that day, the whole event. Okay, and so that's because it's a high impact event. Just like 9/11, you guys will probably remember 9/11, where you were that day 10 years from now, 20 years from now, 30 years from now. So you can remember high impact events many decades later. Like, for example, low impact events, you just forget. Like, I don't remember what I did a week ago during the day. I can't remember what exactly I did 2 days ago, or low impact events come and go, but high impact events stay with you for a long time. Now, someone may say, why don't we have more written about Jesus? Like, why not? Can't they just go around and just go down to the drugstore and buy like a notepad and write it down? And they just sell notebooks all over the place and pens, and you can just write down everything, right? It's just so easy. Well, no, it's a completely different culture. And so, just like John Walton and Craig Keener say here, and notice what they say. Writing material is expensive. For example, a copy of the Gospel of Mark may have required the equivalent of early 21st century buying power of $1,000, $2,000 US money. Works as large as these were major literary undertakings requiring so much papyrus. That's what they wrote on, right? In terms of early 21st century buying power, the larger Gospels may have been worth thousands of US dollars. Normally, antiquity readers know who produced such major works, whether by information on the outside of the scroll or by knowledge circulated only by word of mouth. In a work this size, speaking of the Gospels, authorship would be one of the last details forgotten. And so he's talking there about why the Gospel authors don't necessarily write their name on it at the beginning, like this is written by John, or this is written by Matthew, this is written by Mark, and so people try to criticize the Gospels about that, but there's certainly certain lengths to what you can write, and it's going to cost more to write more, and getting papyri isn't exactly cheap. So, okay. Some people might say the Gospels are hearsay. That means that, you can't cross-examine the eyewitnesses. They're not there to talk about what happened. They're dead. Of course they're dead. We know that. So, can you trust them if they can't be cross-examined today? Well, this is ridiculous, because obviously there's just all kinds of things in the past, history or historical events that happen where you can't interview the witnesses. Obviously, everybody knows that. Things happened so long ago, there's no way to examine the witnesses or cross-examine them. So if you're going to apply this to the Gospels, you have to apply it to a lot of things in history. You wouldn't know anything in history if you're going to use that objection. So it's kind of ridiculous. But remember, if we're talking about sources, like there's something we call like a primary source and a secondary source. So a primary source is the testimony of a direct eyewitness. That's someone that was a contemporary of the events. They're right there. They observed it. The secondary source is somebody that wasn't necessarily a direct eyewitness, but they got their information from the primary sources. Like if you're there, you come along and you weren't there to see Jesus, but you didn't see Jesus do something, but then you talk to the direct eyewitness that was there to see Jesus do that. You listen to what they have to say, and you become a secondary source. Okay, that, of course, that happens a lot in history. It happens in a lot of things, right? All right. So one thing is interesting is we talk about like eyewitnesses to the Gospels. It comes from the word autopsy. That's what that means in Greek. And so that means that the person who's writing about it had to participate in the events. They had to be alive. Okay. They had to be in the time span of Jesus's life. Okay. Who's writing about it. And like I said, sometimes there's direct eyewitnesses and there are indirect eyewitnesses. So let's talk about this. So Luke would probably be an indirect eyewitness because he says right here, he says, as many have undertaken to compile a narrative of the events that have been fulfilled among us, just as though those who are eyewitnesses from the beginning, ministers of the word, have handed them down to us. See, these things have been handed down to him. He says, I too decide, after investigating everything accurately and anew, to write it down in orderly sequence for you, most Theophilus, so you may realize the certainty of the teachers you've received. So Luke very clearly is saying that he is not a direct eyewitness of the events recorded in the Gospel of Luke. Luke was researching and talking to people that were the direct eyewitnesses, right? He says he got his information from the beginning from those who are eyewitnesses and ministers of the word. That's fine. Because Luke has a lot of things that are very accurate, as we'll talk about. He gets a lot of things incredibly accurate. So the point is he's not a direct eyewitness. And then you have like John, who seems to be a direct eyewitness. He seems to be acquainted with the Jewish feasts at the time. He knows a lot about those Jewish feasts. He seems to be an apostle, one of the 12 disciples. So John talks about that at the end of John, he wrote these things down so you may believe, so he's an example of a direct eyewitness. Then you get Mark. Mark is probably more of an indirect eyewitness or indirect witness because he seems to get a lot of his information from Peter. That's generally what most people believe, that, of course, Mark names Simon with reference to Peter 7 times and Peter 19 times. So Peter's really he gains a lot of information from Peter, okay, which is fine. It's not like Peter didn't know what was going on. So, most of the early writers, the church or fathers or church apologists early on all believe Mark was using Peter's teachings. Mark got a lot of his information from Peter. So whatever, for what it's worth, that's generally the consensus here. Now, all the early manuscripts we have all have the manuscripts we have all have the Gospels. I mean, the names of the Gospels you have now, they're all in the earliest manuscripts. Like they all say Gospel according to Matthew, Mark, Luke, John. No copies have ever been found that didn't have their name on it. The copies we have now, the dates of 2nd, 3rd, 4th century and on at least. So all the ancient manuscripts attribute authorship to those 4 gospel authors that you have. So there's absolutely no manuscript evidence and no support to claim that the gospels originally had no titles. Okay, and so it's just something to remember if you care or not. Okay, one thing else that historians look for when they're looking at the gospels, they want to know if the authors told the truth. You may say to yourself, well, how do we know they told the truth? I mean, anyone can write anything, right? But do we have any way to test them to know they're telling the truth? Well, yes, we do. Okay. Some people may say, well, they're written by the insiders. These guys are biased. Maybe they're just making stuff up. Well, that's not true. Because just because you're biased about something doesn't mean you can't tell the truth. And sometimes when you're biased, it just means you're very passionate about something and you really want to get the story right. Okay. So, if someone says they're biased to me, oh, they're biased. And so I'm like, well, does that mean they're lying? Tell me where they're lying. Can you show me where they fabricated something? Make them show it to you. They can't really show you. So that's just kind of like a cultural objection. Most people don't go deeper on it, but it really doesn't hold up any ground, hold up well at all. Okay. Now, there is no doubt that the New Testament authors do record things that are quite embarrassing to them. Like if I was Peter and I was talking to Mark and Mark's recording the life of Peter or things Peter did, I would not tell Mark. I would tell Mark to leave out certain things about my life. Like I denied Jesus. That would be embarrassing. I went and said I'm a disciple, but yet I went out and turned around and totally denied Jesus 3 times, right? That would be embarrassing. Or the disciples falling asleep on Jesus. That's kind of embarrassing. Just the whole crucifixion is kind of embarrassing because that's not the way they thought the Messiah was supposed to die, or they thought that was embarrassing because crucifixion is a sign of rejection and shame and embarrassment. So that's kind of embarrassing thing about Jesus. He was crucified. Also, disciples seem to be confused a lot. They don't seem to follow Jesus's teaching when he tells them he's going to die and rise from the dead. They seem to not get it. That's kind of embarrassing to them. It's counterproductive to put that in there. Also, the testimony of the women, of course, at the tomb, that's embarrassing because women didn't really have a high standing in that culture. So trusting their testimony would be kind of weird. They don't have as much as a high standing as like we maybe do today. But the point is that there's a whole lot of embarrassing details in the Gospels. So, that would only help our case because they have to be authentic. Why would they want to record that stuff if it's not authentic? Okay. So there's all kinds of historical people in the New Testament, many names of people who have been confirmed by archaeology, real people, right? Herod, other people, definitely. These have been confirmed by archaeology. Real places, real people. Look at Luke, what he says here. Look at his accuracy. I mean, you think he's not recording history? Look at that. His details, the details he puts there. Excuse me. Sound like he's making up a story? I don't think so. Okay. Exact date is given. All 8 people are known from history. All are known to live at this exact time. Now, Luke also wrote a lot of things in the book of Acts that have been confirmed by archaeology as well. That's in this book by Colin Hemmer, the book of Acts and Hellenistic Study. He says there's 84 historically confirmed eyewitness details in the book of Acts. So pretty impressive. Luke is very interested in history and getting it right. Some of them are right here. All these are recorded in the book of Acts, just some of them. So I'm not going to read them all, but certainly there's plenty that he definitely gets right. Okay. So we're talking about real history, real places, real people, real events. Okay. John is similar. If you read the book of Gospel of John, he seems to also record a lot of things that have been recorded by archaeology has confirmed a lot of things in the book of John. 59 historically confirmed details that have been confirmed from the book of John. He seems to be aware of the Israeli geography and customs. We also, I think I showed this before, that we also found the Pilate inscription, or they found the Pilate inscription in 1961 that had a recording of the actual Pilate that ordered Jesus' crucifixion. That's on a stone they found there. Pilate was a real person. They found this crucifixion victim, 1968, similar to the way Jesus would have been crucified. He was called Yehohanan, but they found a lot of crucifixion victims. The way the Romans practice crucifixion, this is the way Jesus is seen in the Gospels, the way he was crucified, with the nails through the heels and nails through the ankles, or through the ankles and the wrists. So that's interesting. That's obviously not Jesus's bones, but I'm saying that's similar to how he would have been crucified. Oh yeah, I already showed that. Sorry. Just another picture of the same thing, the Pilate inscription. We also found the Caiaphas Ossuary. Now, they found a bunch of these ossuaries in Israel. These are the bone boxes of people, of families. So when you die, what happens is all the bones of the family, like all together, get put together in one ossuary, like all the family members, their bones, okay? And they found a ton of these in Israel. And one of them found was the bone box of Caiaphas. He was the one that ordered the execution of Jesus in Mark chapter 14. He was a Jewish high priest, okay? In Mark chapter 14. So that's kind of cool. You seem to have some archaeological evidence for both Caiaphas and Pilate, and they both were involved in Jesus's crucifixion. Okay. The place of the skull, they've identified that. That's located next to the Garden Tomb outside the Damascus Gate. You can obviously go see that in Israel. They found this. This is a inscription of one of Paul's first converts during his first missionary journey. That's the name of that guy right there. Sergius Paulus, one of Paul's first people Paul led to the Lord in Acts 13. They found an inscription here in Rome. Kind of interesting. So overall, Luke actually records 32 countries, 54 cities, 9 islands, and has 12 confirmed ruling figures without any heirs. So it's kind of interesting. I showed you the king right there. They have coins of that. I showed you that slide that he was a real person. Anyway, they found those coins there. They also found this. This is in the Gospel of John. The pool here that's talked about, in John chapter 5. So anyways, kind of interesting. They found a boat that's very similar kind of boat Jesus would have been on the Sea of Galilee. This thing was so delicate when they found it in the water. Of course, they, was trying to get it up out of the water and get it preserved in a museum. But that's similar to the size of a boat that would fit in the Sea of Galilee. Accommodate over a dozen males. It's over 26 feet long, 7 feet wide. So they were able to preserve that. But that's probably similar to the kind of boat Jesus and his disciples would have had. This is a rock-cut tomb. This is the kind of tomb Jesus would have been buried in. This was not able, Jesus couldn't afford this tomb. His family couldn't afford it because they were poor. That is why when Joseph of Arimathea comes to Pilate asking for a proper burial for Jesus, or he wants to bury him, Joseph of Arimathea puts Jesus's body in his family tomb because Joseph of Arimathea can't afford this tomb because he's rich and Jesus isn't. Okay, and so this is what a rock-cut tomb would look like. It costs more money, but that's the kind of tomb Jesus would have been buried in. The gospel writers also refer to a lot of towns that are real places, obviously. Plenty of towns, plenty of regions that are real, no doubt about it. Real places, real times, real people. They refer to certain bodies of water, other geographical places, no doubt. They're real, they exist, okay? So the frequency of geographical references, look at this. Total Greek words, Matthew 18,347, Mark 11,103, Luke 19,463, John 15,445. So you can see how many towns and bodies of water and other places they mention in their writings in the Gospels. Now, we talk about the transmission of the New Testament. That gets into what we call the biographical test. Certainly we have a lot of manuscripts, and we have the Dead Sea Scrolls now that could have a very early manuscript in Mark. One of the earliest manuscripts we have in the New Testament is from the Gospel of John. And what we see is that we have more manuscripts in the New Testament than these other writings. Now that's a good thing. That means that New Testament critical scholars or critical textual scholars, they can compare the documents. They have more to compare from, right? And we have earlier manuscripts than some of these other ones, right? Only 25 years. The other ones, Homer's 500. The first copy we have, and the other one's 500, 1400 years. The earliest copy we have here is much closer. So we have a lot of early manuscripts, and remember that when they find these manuscripts, of course, there are going to be some scribal errors on them, definitely. Sometimes there might be a letter missing or a word missing or a misspelling, but they're able to still make out the message of what it says. Just if you got a manuscript that said something like this, if you're missing the word J here, or a whole word's missing or something, or a letter, not a whole word, but letters, you probably would be able to still make out what the manuscript's trying to say. But the good news is they have so many manuscripts to compare. So that's a good thing. The more, the merrier. Okay. You know, sometimes people will say the Bible's been recopied so many times. Sometimes you hear that from skeptics or just like people who don't understand the translation process. And just remember that of the 22,000 lines in the New Testament, only 40 are contested. About 400 words, the only ones that are contested. And they really don't impact any significant doctrine at all. Okay. You have over a 99.5% transmission accuracy. And, you know, like D.A. Carson says here, he's a New Testament guy. He says the fact that people say the Bible's been translated and recopied so many times is really quite uninformed. D.A. Carson sums up the findings this way: the purity of the text is of such substantial nature, nothing we believe to be true and nothing we are commanded to do is anyway jeopardized by the variants. So what he's talking about when he says the variants, those are different. The manuscripts they have sometimes have variant readings, like they're missing letters or missing something like a scribal error. And then he's saying they're still able to get the message, see what they really were saying. Okay, it doesn't really impact what they're really saying. So he's saying it's not really a problem. Anyway, so okay, let me see here. Also, yes, we have things about Jesus outside the New Testament. There are writings about Jesus in Josephus and some of these other writings, Tacitus. We've always had these. They're not like, I wouldn't say they're as reliable as like the New Testament. They're okay. I mean, you know, they give little things, references about Jesus, but nothing that's spectacular. And some of them are debated. But you could probably, reading those documents, you probably would get these features. You probably would realize Jesus was a real person from Nazareth. He lived a virtuous life. He was known as a miracle worker. He was crucified under Pilate. You know, his disciples believe he rose from the dead. His disciples thought he was divine. His disciples thought that they worshiped him. That's in a book by F.F. Bruce called Jesus and Christian Origins. He's summarizing there. Now, I personally think this is a good book if you want to go deeper on that topic. And I will say that those things are not, like I said, all of these are not near as good as the New Testament itself. Okay. And like I said, you know, we're lucky we have any writings at all about Jesus. Jesus was not a superstar, believe it or not. He was considered a failed Jewish messianic pretender in the first century. The Romans didn't care about him. They thought Jews are superstitious. We're even lucky any of these people write about Jesus or write about his followers. So you have to go deeper to study these, you know, but personally, I think that it's really not the most important thing. I think the New Testament is fine and we have enough there. So, okay. Well, having said that, that'll be about it. And we can chit chat now.